Tēnā koutou katoa au ka takarura mai anō ki tēnei o tātou taiwhanga pāpāho i tāmaki makaurau, tāmaki hereherenga waka Aotearoa New Tinini te mihi atu nei. Welcome back, everyone. It's great to have you back here at the APEC CEO Summit 2021, hosted in Aotearoa New Zealand, tāmaki makaurau in Auckland City.
Kia ora, Julian. Our next session is focused on the primacy of trust and the need for business to operate at the intersection of culture, purpose and society to build trust, something increasingly important to stakeholders, employees, customers and investors. To introduce our first keynote speaker on this topic, it is my pleasure to invite Keren Blakey, Chair of PricewaterhouseCoopers New Zealand, to the stage.
Kia ora, I'm Keren Blakey, Chair of PwC New Zealand. PwC is delighted to be a premier partner and the exclusive knowledge partner for the APEC CEO Summit for the 12th year. One of the major themes for this year's summit is the primacy of trust. I will shortly introduce Richard Edelman, President and Chief Executive of the world's largest public relations firm, who will talk to this in more detail. But before I do, I wanted to share with you briefly how we at PwC are helping our clients build and maintain trust in today's world. Trust is central to the success of every business and organisation. Yet it has never been more difficult out there to earn and maintain. A fundamental shift is also happening in how businesses respond to global issues, such as the climate crisis, changing demographics and equity issues. At PwC, we're responding to these challenges through our latest global strategy, the New Equation. This strategy is how PwC brings together unique combinations of our people, powered by technology, making a community of solvers to address these challenges. The foundation of this strategy is our multidisciplinary model. This allows us to help clients build trust and deliver sustained outcomes, bringing together that deep expertise across a broad range of capabilities. It is this combination of capabilities that's so essential to delivering high-quality outcomes for our clients, our stakeholders, and society more broadly. It is now with great privilege that I introduce Richard Edelman to talk more on the topic of trust. Richard Edelman, as mentioned, is President and Chief Executive of the world's largest public relations firm. Edelman is an authority on the public's trust in business, government, media and non-government organisations. With that real epidemic of misinformation out there and widespread mistrust of societal institutions and leaders around the world, this conversation will be essential to understanding the primacy of trust and the opportunity out there for business to rebuild trust. Today, we believe that consumers are choosing their businesses and their brands on the basis they are ethical, transparent and authentic, with a clear purpose beyond profit. We look forward to your contribution to this important topic. Please welcome Richard Edelman.
So thank you so much. I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C. I'm going to, in 15 minutes, try to cover the trust landscape, a challenging assignment. So if we can move forward, the first thing to know is that we talk to respondents all over the world. They really break into two parts. One is informed publics who are 75K plus in income, college plus educated, 3 or 4 media a day, and then online general population, the other 85% of the people we speak to. And we do this in 28 countries around the world. Next. So basically, we've been following trust for 20 years. The major trends over that period of time are dispersion of authority away from elites. We saw a decline of business in 2008 related to the Great Recession. We then saw in 2016, 2017, a crisis of trust coincident with populism. And most recently, the idea that business is now, for the first time, the most trusted institution in the world as of January. Next. In fact, what we see in this slide is, for the first time, business passed NGOs and government. Government had been the most trusted institution as recently as at the height of the pandemic in May 2020. NGOs for the prior 19 years had been the most important and trusted institution. Next. We see that, in fact, business is the most trusted because it's the only one seen as both ethical and competent. Historically, business is competent, not ethical. Over the last 3 years, business has steadily been rising up on the ethics scale. NGOs are ethical, not competent. Media and government are neither competent nor ethical. Next. What we see, in fact, is that trust, which historically is conveyed from top down, from authority figures, that stopped about 10 years ago, coincident with the Great Recession, moved to horizontal, to peer-to-peer. A person like myself now is in local, my employer. Look at those numbers, universal across the world, high numbers. Well over business is my employer, in my CEO. Next. What we also see is, in this critical role for employers, not only is my employer the most trusted institution, my employer media, that in fact mainstream media trails that of the company newsletter. So in fact, because media is politicized, I believe my employer. Next. Employees are the most important stakeholder for the first time. Historically, this has been investors, then clients or customers, now employees. How you treat your employees becomes a vital part of whether you're able to sell products, whether you're able to attract talent. Next. We also see, this is the comparison of net trust scores, which is the average of business, government, NGOs, and media across the world, that historically there is a quite high number for what I would say is developing Asia. In other words, India, China, Indonesia, always high numbers. At the lower end, Japan, really since Fukushima, Korea, etc. So again, there's what I would say developing Asia and developed Asia. And developed Asia is much, much less optimistic. Also, I want you to know the low numbers for the United States. We have tumbled from the high middle to the lower part of the echelon. Next. What you see is, again, the difference between the developing Asia in the top and the developed Asia at the bottom, Australia, Korea, Japan. And again, what I want you to point out here is to understand that the China drop in a year was totally related to drop in trust in business, not in government. Business went from mid-80s to 60s, partly because the government has been whacking business like Alibaba and Didi. Next. We also see that trust in country brands matters. We see a decline generally in trust capital for national brands, but most profoundly for the Brits, for the Americans. In fact, China brand has never come up. It's always been low. India's below, Mexico's below that. And then again, how much do you trust the national government of each foreign country? Well, China is at the bottom. This is a Trump phenomenon. Still, that number relates to the Trump administration. I suspect it'll have some rise this year. Next. Trust inequality is a deeply important subject for all of you APEC CEOs. Appreciate that trust gap between elites and mass population was only in the US, UK, and France until about 4 or 5 years ago. Now, this is a universal phenomenon across the world, transversal, that we see double-digit delta. The highest country in the world on the delta, Australia. That's a stunner. France, South Africa are also at the highest level. Next. I just again want to show you, just for APEC, the degree to which there is now a trust gap. And that delta indicates populism, indicates electoral change, indicates dissatisfaction over time. Next. I also want to say that this slide is deeply important because historically you had trust in traditional societal leaders, CEOs, journalists, government leaders. Those are all at the bottom. Who is trusted? Well, it's to do with expertise, meaning scientists, local, meaning my employer, and then peer-to-peer. So more or less, we see a bifurcated world on trust in spokespeople. Next. The media is a sad story. It's a little bit like an airplane running out of gas. It's been going like this and suddenly it's really hitting the deck. And it has to do with especially low scores for social media. But the paradox is, even if we don't trust it, we rely more and more on it. 40% of people say they no longer read mainstream media. Well, they rely on social media even if they don't trust it. And 10 times more people share false news, fake news, than real news. Big problem. Next. Why? Basically, we believe that the media is not objective, that the media supports ideology, that journalists, in fact, try to mislead people, that they're chasing clicks, that it's all about the business model. And again, look at the scores in Asia for poor performance for media, Japan, Korea, etc. Next. Deeply important. What matters to me since the pandemic? Of course, my family. But look at the scores of increase about increasing my literacy, about science, about information in general. Basically, people recognize their own shortcomings on quality information that enables good decisions. Next. Climate concerns. We are still in COP26. Just look at how high the numbers are about worry about climate. And this is cross-gender, cross-income, cross-country. Fascinating to us, though. Next slide. I told you that business was the most trusted institution in the world. It's not about sustainability. Be clear that even if business is seen as the most competent, it is seen as all hat and no cattle. That's a Texas expression. Basically, in short, we're promising too much and delivering too little. Whatever we do on climate needs to be premised on action. Why is it that government is the most trusted? Next slide. Because more or less, only government can compel change. 2/3. Business won't make the changes necessary to avoid consequences of climate change unless government forces them to. Similarly, respondents said people won't make the changes themselves unless government forces them to through mandate. So in short, the government is the big stick. Next. I will tell you more broadly, though, beyond sustainability, there is a major set of issues on which business is expected to lead. And specifically, CEOs step in when government doesn't fix problems, take the lead on change, hold themselves accountable to the public and not just to the shareholders. And this is on everything from diversity and inclusion, job retraining, education more broadly, even issues such as policing or on areas that traditionally are government. Well, government is stymied. Business has to fill in. Next. Specifically, speak up about the pandemic, about retraining, about societal issues. Almost 85% expect you to speak out on these societal challenges. Remember that trust is local. We need you to be our advocate. I'm an employee. I want you to represent me. I'm a consumer. I'll buy your brand, but the deal is you'll speak up. Next. In short, CEOs, you are now feeling pressure from consumers, investors, and employees. So, belief-driven buying is a new phenomenon, brand democracy. In other words, we find that 62% say, I will switch, choose, boycott a brand based on its stand on societal issues. Stunning. Belief-driven employees, 60% say, I will leave my employer if I am not consistent with your values and beliefs. You need to show me a North Star, Unilever Sustainable Living Plan as an example. Finally, 92% of American investors agree. Business leaders have an obligation to use their power to advocate for positive change in society. The Larry Fink, BlackRock initiative, the Business Roundtable push for a stakeholder approach, all is consistent with this. Next. Employees. There's a new compact with employees. It is no longer enough to just pay people. They expect flexible work conditions. They also expect to be consistent with your approach to the world. So I have a higher expectation of my prospective employer than a couple of years ago. Next. In fact, 1 in 3 have left their job because you remain silent. Silence is not an option. CEOs, you have to speak up. You have to represent the best of the world because there is no one else at the moment. Next. A majority now actually choose jobs based on beliefs. Look at the numbers in China and India. Those stunned us. We thought this was definitely a Western phenomenon, not so. Developing markets are even ahead of the developed markets on this idea of I will vote with my feet. Next. This slide is fundamental. Remember, if you are an employer and you take a stand, whether it's in the wake of the murder of George Floyd in the US or even on COP26, you are going to benefit. You're going to benefit on human rights, on income inequality, on gender equality. Don't put your head down. Lead from the front. You will get big jumps in trust, especially from your younger employees. Take the chance. Next. So I have a 4-point plan for you to consider. 1, you have an expanded mandate. It is absolutely sure that business is the most trusted institution. It will be so again in January, I am certain, because government is seen to have failed. But you can't just talk from top down. You've got to lead. You got to do things. Second, sustainability is an urgent matter for every institution. We have got to solve for sustainability, change our supply chains, do things. Third, the role of the CEO, because trust is local, you've got a bigger job to do, whether it's systemic racism, upskilling, be sure that you're out front. Fourth, embrace this new idea of an employer-employee compact. Allow your employees to speak up, listen to them, make sure that they feel as if you are advocating for them. If you do that, the employees will stand with you. So in short, I have given you a very fast landscape of trust, business the most trusted institution, government tailing really far behind, NGOs almost absent, the media failing in terms of quality information. We have an urgent need to catalyze the world behind tangible change. Trust to do the right thing is the core proposition for legitimate leadership of institutions. I thank you for the opportunity and wish you a great conference. Thank you.
Tēnā rawa atu koe, Richard Edelman, the CEO and president of the world's biggest public relations company, that is, of course, Edelman. Very profound insights there, eh, Julian?
Yeah, in such a short time too. Yeah. So much to unpack there, and thankfully we've got a panel of experts to be able to do that straight after this, so I really thank them. But some really key points to go through. Maybe start at the end of that presentation from Richard, where he talked about the 4 key notes for CEOs. Number 1, the expanded mandate, the need or the wish or the desire for many for people to talk not just from top down, but also to lead their organisations, their businesses. Number 2, to solve for sustainability. Again, that aligns to the messages that we've heard previously throughout this APEC CEO Summit. Number 3, to be out front, to also with the expanded role of the CEO, that the role has increased obviously, but the need to be more out front and to undertake those responsibilities on behalf of the organisation, but also for the communities. And then number 4, the employee-employer relationship, to speak up and to advocate. That's right. Which is interesting because we talk about this in Māori organisations, right? About the Article 3 line, where the government has Article 3 responsibilities. Everything above that line, the government advocates and leads for. But what we're hearing more and more, particularly for iwi organisations, indigenous organisations, is to also take up some of that responsibility themselves.
Absolutely.
We see that in Aotearoa with vaccination programs.
To lead by example. Another quote from Richard Edelman there: silence is not an option. That resonates quite a lot. Employees are opting to leave their places of work if their values aren't aligned and they don't deliver. They, as in CEOs or employers, don't deliver on the promises they espouse. So, it's about walking the talk, not talking the talk, and not delivering.
And some interesting points on the media, Orieni, because we're both in the media, some of which probably won't be a surprise. Julian. And he did also make a cautionary note about the fact that this was taken at the time. Some of these results come out of previous administrations, right? But there's some interesting notes about the media and the loss of trust that people, populations, communities have in those traditional media organisations. They know that there's a lot of false news on social media, but they're still getting their news from social media as opposed to traditional organisations. Interesting stuff. As I say, we now have a panel coming up soon, and closely linked to what Richard has just spoken about, there is a growing demand from stakeholders to see that businesses are creating value whilst still applying environmental, social and governance principles, ESG, to their strategy and operations to achieve sustainable development. They want to understand how a business operates, treats employees and customers, and whether they are engaged ethically with their supply chain.
To continue this discussion, our next panel will share their experience in driving ESG through strategy and operations. Moderating this panel is Diane Brady, Assistant Managing Editor, Communities and Leadership at Forbes. Tēnā koe, Diane. Diane, over to you.
Hi everybody, and welcome to day 2 of the APEC CEO Summit, one of my favorite events. And I'm very sad not to be there, but thrilled to be with you virtually. And thanks, of course, to Richard Edelman for setting the tone for today, talking about the primacy of trust, which is so important. And 3 of those key metrics are environmental, social, governance, ESG principles, which we are talking about today with 3 fantastic speakers. In studio, we have Andrew Grant, Senior Partner, McKinsey & Company. Hello, Andrew.
Hello to Diane.
And we have Keren Silk, General Manager, Link Strategy Sustainability for Westpac New Zealand. Hi, Keren.
Kia ora tātou.
And coming from Sydney, last certainly not least, Kristen Stubbins, who heads the audit practice, a partner at PwC Australia. Hi, Kristen.
Hi, good morning, everyone.
So last shall not be least, Kristen, I want to start with you just with a lightning round coming off COP26. Let's just set the tone with some of your impressions.
Well, Diane, I've been thinking it's been a tough couple of years, and actually the last couple of weeks have been great. I'm feeling quite optimistic. I was really, really pleased to hear the announcement yesterday of China and the US working together around climate. It's potentially the one issue that those two nations can really take forward and work together on. I also am encouraged by the announcement of the International Sustainability Standards Board, which I think is really going to set the tone for business. So overall, I'm feeling a lot better today than I did a couple of weeks ago.
Right. Andrew, are you feeling a lot better today than a couple of weeks ago?
Look, absolutely. And look, it's I think one of the other things that I'd just echo Kristen's thinking here, I mean, there's no doubt the US-China announcement was just terrific news. Two other things that I would highlight. One is the engagement on some of the detail, the fact that people realise we're now dealing with a $4 to $5 trillion per year capital reallocation issue, and that people actually engaged on the substance. For me, that's a real sense that we're starting to get real. And the second thing, picking up a little bit on Richard's theme, the degree to which I think employees are holding their management teams and their boards to account. There is a real sense that organisations want to be, their people want them to be on the right side of history. And there's no doubt that COP26, I think, has unleashed more than many people realise around that energy within organisations.
Great. Keren, how about you? I know you've been involved in these issues for quite some time.
Yeah, look, I think what's been really great to see is that there's better conversation around some really stretching goals that will lead towards a net zero by 2050. I guess the real question from here, though, is what are the actions that are going to happen in order to fulfil those promises that governments are signing up to? And that's the thing that is going to need a lot of collaboration between government and business, and between businesses working together with the community to take the big steps forward that this COP's been talking about.
Well, I think that's a perfect way to segue actually over to you, Andrew, because I'm really curious what clients are telling you regarding ESG, and also where some of the well-intentioned companies may be making mistakes.
Well, Diana, I think one of the fundamental things that we're seeing with ESG versus, the history of things like corporate social responsibility and the like, people now realise to really move the dial to make a difference, the actions required are expensive, they're substantial, and they have to be core to an organisation's strategy. They just can't be off to the side. They can't be window dressing. They can't be box ticking exercises. So the encouraging thing for us is we're coming to see where ESG is actually now in the absolute centre of the direction, the purpose of an organisation. So I think that's good news. The second thing is organisations know that they are going to be held to account. Very much Keren's point about, talk is cheap. It's the actions. And I think organisations, particularly I think boards, are really recognising that they cannot tread lightly. If they make commitments, they're truly going to be held to account. So I think there's a steely determination that people are seeing that. The surprising thing for us a little bit is we all thought that it was going to be governments that set the tone, maybe shareholders would set the tone, maybe the media would set the tone. We are increasingly seeing, again, to Richard's point, it's actually employees, it's organisations, people that are really actually setting the highest bars and being the most demanding of the expectations they have of the institutions that they work for.
Now, Keren, is that your experience, that it is the employees leading the charge? And tell us a little bit about how this is playing out in the ground for you.
Yeah, look, there's definitely an employee voice that's there, and that's something that management and boards need to take a lot of notice of. But New Zealand businesses are alive to the issues. They fully understand that corporate reputation is deeply aligned with business performance and business resilience. And so what we're seeing is corporates now focus very much on those critical ESG issues, so social inequality, climate, environmental degradation. But there's three, here in New Zealand at least, there's three practices that are really starting to come through in the business world that are helping to not only work out what the strategic change that is required, but also how do you operationalise that within your business. And the first one of those is collective leadership. So these are really complex issues. And what we're seeing is member organisations, member networks come together to aligned around a single or a set of commitments that cover the sustainability obligations. And so good examples, Sustainable Business Council and the related Climate Leaders Coalition.
Share best practices, or what's the motivation? Is it just simply because we've had these councils for quite some time? How are they operating differently?
Look, it's the coming together. It's the actual collaboration, not just around the commitment. So not just stating what the commitment is, it's the collaboration together to take it through specific actions. So a good example, low freight carbon group here in New Zealand, nine industry players coming together to work out the pathway through to 2050. Setting goals for themselves, 2025, 2030. 2030, let's halve carbon emissions. So really clear, actionable goals coming together. And then the second point around these organisations is that the commitment you make has to be actionable. It also has to be verifiable. There's no point just getting out there and talking. People want to see what the action is that you're taking. And so the verification is really, really important. And then be transparent and report how you're going against those goals. That's absolutely critical if you want to be able to lean on and build trust with the community.
Right. Kristen, we talk a lot about ESG and we often focus a lot these days on the E. I know that the G is one that's particularly important to you. Talk a bit about that.
Yeah, and so actually just picking up on a couple of the points that Andrew made, when we think about who are our stakeholders, or when a CEO or a board sort of think about who are their stakeholders, I think that's actually changed. And so, it's not just shareholders anymore. There are this broader group of stakeholders that need to be considered, certainly employees, but also more broadly, the community and community sentiment really needs to be factored into, how is a company putting forward the substance of its strategy. And I really think that's very important in terms of governance to say, what is the substance of the strategy that's sort of underpinning all of this ESG statements and disclosures that companies are putting out? Because as both Andrew and Keren have said, it's very easy to make statements. It's actually the substance and what you do about them that's really important. So governance has a really, really important role to play there, because ultimately it's going to be the responsibility of the boards to hold management to account, to make sure that the substance of what's being disclosed to the market is correct.
Well, it's interesting because it feels in many ways, Andrew, I'll go to you with this first, that we don't have the luxury of making commitments because so many of these climate realities are here today. If you're a winemaker in California, you can only put sunscreen on your grapes for so long until you have to make a decision. So I would love to know, what are the biggest challenges that you see clients dealing with? And I know McKinsey's done a lot of work around climate math. Can you give us some sense of just how even the current realities are making some decisions come out differently right now?
Well, I mean, Diane, it's a terrific question. And look, I think one is just to echo your point that this is now real. This is now mission critical for clients in their organisation. So they are really committing the management share of mind and the thinking required to lean into these issues. The other recognition that I think is interesting about that gives me optimism is there's a real recognition that taking ESG seriously, integrating into the core strategy of the organisation is not just good for the world or good for shareholders, which, I mean, those are good things in their own right. I think there's a real recognition now that these things are actually existential to the organisation itself. They are very much in their own interests to pursue this and to meaningfully pursue this. And there's a little bit of a recognition that if you look at some of the other big trends impacting organisations, the future of work, the fourth industrial revolution, in many respects, incumbent organisations are actually quite well positioned to benefit from those trends. With climate and the broader ESG agenda, attackers, startups, smaller firms are actually better positioned in many respects. So we're actually now finding our larger client organisations are actually saying, we really have to take this seriously, because existentially for us, it's in our own interests to really get on with it. So I think over the last 12, 18 months, that's been the most meaningful shift of this recognition that, it's great for the world, but we're not going to be around if we don't take this seriously and if we don't purposely move forward.
So Keren, how is this, talk a little bit about what you're doing at Westpac, because the realities are here today, and feel free to encompass the whole E, S, and G component of that.
Yeah, so obviously we're doing a lot of work around the climate arena, understanding our own portfolio risk, to Andrew's point, understanding our current position and our clients' position and how we work with them. But also the S in ESG is becoming much more prevalent in discussion. And so one of the critical things you can do as a large organisation is think about how you use your own footprint, how you use your own purchasing power, for example, in your supply chain, to try and create fairer outcomes. Because it's important for us that we exist in a healthy economy that's making the most of all of the resources that are available. So for us, we've set a 2025 target to have 25% of our procurement diversified. For us, that means we need to get much more engaged with Māori and Pacifica businesses. So we've become a founding member of Amatai. Amatai was set up off the back of an Australian initiative, actually, to create a national directory of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander businesses. So that's enabling Australian companies to now engage with those businesses from a purchasing perspective and creating a better outcome for more vulnerable communities. We need to do the same here. We have the same issues here in New Zealand with our indigenous communities, and so that's one of the critical things for us we think we've got the ability to take action on.
Great. And Kristen, I'd be remiss if I'm talking to somebody in an audit practice and I don't start talking about numbers and metrics. So can you talk about how people talk about a double bottom line, but how exactly is ESG being incorporated into the metrics of both reporting and also, frankly, budgeting and how companies operate day to day?
Yeah, so I think as everyone here today has said, this topic is certainly on the agenda of pretty much every CEO I talk to. And so that obviously means that it's on the agenda, it's in the numbers. And as companies start to look to, how are we going to actually practically make these commitments that we've made? A lot of companies around the world have made significant net zero commitments. They need to be really clear and transparent about what's the pathway to reaching those commitments and, what are the metrics and milestones that need to be met along the way. I know, Diane, we've been incredibly optimistic so far in this conversation. I would say I still think we've got a really long way to go in terms of, the transparency of disclosure and the level of rigour that needs to go into, calculating the milestones, the measures, the metrics that get disclosed. I'm really hopeful that with the creation of this new International Sustainability Standards Board, which is sort of like, if you think the financial reporting world, there's a really established framework.
Like FASB, right?
Yeah, exactly. FASB in the US and IFRS, international standards, etc. So that sort of framework needs to be replicated in the sustainability world, and I think that's coming. We need to learn from the lessons of the last 100 years where we've actually, pretty much got a good capital market around financial reporting, very established. That needs to now come into play for ESG, and it is coming, but I just don't want to sugarcoat how far away we are from great in that space.
Yeah, well, it's a good point. And Andrew, I think one of the interesting questions, we are at a CEO Summit, and the window through which this sort of change happens. Does it happen a lot right now through digital transformation, for example? And there is always this tension there around the future of work, which you mentioned. How do you basically use automation, which is very good for the planet in many cases, not always very good for workers. I'd love to get a little more sense for you as to how companies come to this and how they're balancing all these different priorities.
Yeah. Well, Diane, again, it's a terrific question. Look, the answer I'd have is arguably in an organisation today, the most important process that you have as an organisation is your resource allocation process, particularly capital allocation. We would argue that ESG, you now need to think about bringing the level of rigour and process discipline, some of the metrics that Kristen talked about, you need to bring that same process discipline to the organisation that you would approach your capital allocation process in the way that that permeates all levels of the organisation. So we would argue ESG, you now need to think about that in the same way, bringing the level of rigour, thoughtfulness, transparency, process discipline to really enable that to happen. So that would be one thing. Diane, to your point, most of these, digitisation, the future of work, many of these things are incredibly sympathetic to ESG. And in an interesting way, we're actually finding it's often the bringing in an ESG lens and making sure that that is holistically included in the assessment is in many respects one of the things that's actually getting some of these business cases over the line. So in many cases, businesses had a number of, cases sitting on the table of, we need to make this investment. It didn't quite get there. We're actually finding when you take a more holistic assessment, a lot of these digitisation, future of work use cases actually get over the line when you take that more holistic assessment.
And before we get to our lightning round of takeaways, Keren, I want to ask you about the S part. You did mention we've not really spoken too much about the pandemic, and Kristen weigh in too. There's been this acceleration, of course, of digitization, but we've also seen a lot of women, drop out of the workforce here in the U.S. What have you found yourself for your company? Is there anything you'd want to say about what you've done to address some of those issues?
Yeah, there's a couple of things there. There's definitely been an impact, and one of the concerning things is impact is greater in more vulnerable communities, and also there is a gender bias in the way that this is landing, and so there's a couple of things that I think that people need to be thinking about is how are you supporting your customers through this period with financial support, but also engaging with them on bringing them together again in networks to talk about the learnings that they've each had in terms of migrating, if it's a business perspective, to an online platform. Or secondly, it's also about how we're working with our most vulnerable consumer customers to help them through a period where they may have incurred a job loss, they need some reprieve. And so those are the kind of things that financial institutions are working with. The second thing, though, is employees, and I think one of the things you've got to be really careful of with this is mental health. And we certainly see a lower level of resilience with our employees. So one of the things we've done in the past couple of months is we've added a week of wellbeing leave for our employees, just to acknowledge that, and this is a perpetual thing, just to acknowledge that actually when you're under stress, when you're trying to cope with kids at the same time as doing your work, it creates mental stress, and so we've got to give the capacity for our employees to recover.
Well, let me. I'm going to just go for a quick 1 word, 2 words from our Kristen, Andrew. Any final thoughts to take away in our counting seconds here?
We're on the right path. Let's just keep going.
Great. Andrew?
Great strategy is unique and distinctive and personal to you. ESG is the same. It can't be everyone looks the same. It's got to be grounded in your own starting point in reality. It has to be unique and distinctive.
Great. Terrific. Well, Keren, Kristen, Andrew, thank you very much. Everybody enjoy the rest of the event.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you so much.
A great discussion there. Our first panel for this session, this block of our broadcast. Keren Silk from Westpac, Kristen Stubbins from PwC, Andrew Grant from McKinsey & Company, of course moderated by Diane Brady from Forbes. Or for Cardle, Julian.
Can I just say, this is awesome. As a former COO, hearing this discussion, because these conversations have started, and I finished as COO at the organisation I was at about 12 months ago. So to hear Keren talking, and obviously Kristen and Andrew in the way that in the discussion that they've just had with Darren is awesome, and so much to pick up on. And I don't want to identify too much now because I might miss some key things out there. But some really good points around auditing, right? Because, auditing, when you're being more transparent with your community, the metrics and the framework that you apply to be able to report on that's going to be really interesting, right? So that's why I say I think it's awesome because these conversations are being had, they have to be had. And as our panels just said, I think there's a lot in it that CEOs can take out of that discussion that's just happened to be able to apply into the work that they're doing. Andrew mentioned things like allocation, also, dare I say it, potentially distribution. So what should distribution look like? Not just from a financial return, but in terms of your input back into the community and those kind of things. So look, fascinating discussion. Really thankful to Diane and the panel for that. I thought it was awesome, and the whole summit's been awesome as well, and I hope you're enjoying it as you're watching it around the world. Let's move on now to continue our discussion. It is time for our next keynote interview, and it is a pleasure and a privilege to welcome Tian Wei, who is the moderator for this next discussion. Now, Tian Wei is a former Washington correspondent and now host of World Insight with Tian Wei on CGTN, a high-profile international debate and interview program on CGTN. She is recognised by the World Economic Forum as a young global leader. Tian Wei, kia ora, and it's over to you now.
Hello, everyone. This is Tian Wei, host and moderator from CGTN China Global TV. It's such a pleasure to do this keynote interview for APEC CEO Summit with Tony Fernandez, who is an entrepreneur and CEO of Air Asia Group. Tony, how are you today?
Very good, Kinwen. Thanks for being and inviting me onto this panel.
Thank you so much, Tony. I would imagine your work and life would be extremely busy because the airline industry is one of those sectors mostly impacted by the pandemic. So at this critical time, how are you looking at not only the business, but also the sustainable development part, which you have always been caring about?
Well, I think it has been an incredibly tough time for us. We're now coming out of it. We have been able to use a big asset of ours, which is airline data, to go and pivot into new sectors. In terms of sustainability, it's given us time to relook at this whole sustainability issue. Now, in most cases, people look at sustainability as just climate change, but we've also looked at it from many angles. Number one, surviving. You have to be a sustainable business. But from the climate side, we have been working very hard on carbon offsets in terms of lightening our planes so it doesn't waste so much, working with air traffic control so that we burn less fuel, and working with our engine suppliers and, of course, our aircraft manufacturers to reduce emissions. But I want to add that sustainability is not just about climate change. As an airline, we have to be responsible when we bring millions of tourists into a beach, for instance. We have to make sure that that environment is not destroyed. We have to look at sustainability from the form of human trafficking, etc. So there are many areas for us to focus on.
So it's not just about taking care of the environment, but also tackling with the social and other risks that's related to it.
Correct. And in the airline business, sustainability has also been about surviving. COVID has really hit us badly, and I have to sustain all the jobs that are connected to us as well. And then there's smaller sustainabilities. Tourism and industrialization has destroyed many villages. And so we're very focused on making sure that not everyone leaves their villages and goes into cities. So we work very hard with smaller towns to provide sustainable tourism. So there is employment and there is economic development in the villages in Southeast Asia as well.
I would love to go through some of these points you just mentioned one by one. First of all, about climate change, you said, of course, it's not just about climate change, but it's a big component of it. G20 summit and also COP26 have been dealing with that. Tell me more about how airline industry as a whole do you see is working on the emission issue? And for economic airlines like yours, particularly, how do you see that issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I can just defend the airline industry for 1 second, you know, we get enormous amounts of press and negativity, but actually our emissions are far, far less than, say, the car industry or the power industry. But we all have to play a part. So from our side, I think one of the most important things we can do, certainly in Asia, and certainly with the people flying with us, is education. So we spend a lot of time to say the climate issue is real, that we all have to play a part. We have brought in a voluntary offset charge so that people can contribute to cover their offset costs. In terms of AirAsia, obviously as a low-fare airline, we obviously are much more efficient per square foot because we carry more passengers than, say, an airline that has more business class and first class. So we burn a lot less carbon emissions. But I think governments also have to play a part. A lot of fuel is wasted in air traffic control, in airport planning. So it needs to be the whole aviation ecosystem which takes part in trying to reduce emissions. It isn't just the airline.
It's very interesting you talk about the ecosystem, because now when you listen to the political leaders, including possibly at the APEC Summit, they are talking about, let's have the more private businesses coming in. They're going to play a bigger role to solve the problem. Of course, that's true because they didn't incorporate it and they didn't act inclusively earlier. But it seems that there's a ball being kicked from the business community to the government, from the governments to the business community. Tell me more about that, Tony.
I mean, I'm very much a private industry man, and I think it's not one person. It's all of us has to play a part. We have to educate the public, and I think in Asia Pacific, the public needs to be educated much more about carbon emissions, about plastic, about lots of things. And but I think private industry can't do it by itself. It needs to work with government, and I think government can't do it by itself as well. So there are three components really. There's private industry, there's government, and then there's the people. The people themselves can make a big, big difference if they change their attitude. You know, turning off your lights 1 hour earlier, cutting down air condition use. All of this can have a much bigger impact than flying. So I think it's not just one constituent. All of us have to play a part, private industry, government, and the public.
Let's talk about the aviation industry, particularly about the technologies. You know, there's a lot of talk about how technologies and innovation would be able to help industry to cut the emission. To what extent do you think that is true? And for airlines like yours, how would that work?
Yeah, I mean, we don't make planes or engines, so we're relying on Airbus, Boeing, and GE, and all those dudes. But
are they doing enough? Are they doing enough, Tony, from your perspective?
Well, I think the engine guys have done a great job. I mean, from when I first started 20 years ago to now, we burn substantially less fuel. We have better noise emissions. But if you think about the aviation industry, our plane design hasn't changed for almost 80 years. And we have been using the same combustible fuel technology for a long time. We're now beginning to see electric drones. But I'm not sure that I'll be CEO when we have an electric plane. But I think now, I don't think the manufacturers moved quick enough in the initial stages. But I think now they're working very hard. I think the next step is an electric plane. We're seeing smaller planes. We're seeing drones. When we will see an electric Airbus 320, I'm not sure it's anytime soon. But there's talk on hydrogen planes. But I think for the moment, the airline industry is kind of stuck with the technology we've got, and we just have to maximize what we have within the ecosystem to reduce emissions. I don't see massive technological change in the next 10 years.
Right. Tony, another direction of questions. Businesses have to function in such an uncertain world. This is just an adjective, but for business leaders, every day you have to make decisions on things that you don't even know about. or would not be able to know until it happened. So what does that mean that you are in this intersection, of cultures, of politics, of energy composition changes? How do you look at that?
Yeah, can I give you a live example of how we have to operate in this world? COVID. I fly to America and I need one PCR test. I come back to Asia Pacific and I effectively need 3 PCR tests and I'm quarantined. Governments have to start looking at having unified approaches so that industries such as ours can function. You come from a country which has very little COVID, yet you're still quarantined from 7 to 14 days. Asia Pacific is losing its way and being excessively oversensitive on COVID. We have to get on with things. And so in the airline industry, we are really slap bang in what you've just said. It's very hard to make decisions sometimes because there are many external factors. We have to live and adapt. But, if you allow me, since this is going to Asia Pacific, I think Europe and America are really recovering much faster because they're learning to live with COVID. And in Asia Pacific, we need to be a little bit braver and standardize what is needed to prevent COVID from going, and also realizing that we're never going to get rid of it completely. We have to live with it. As a business leader, that's very tough in this day and age. But, you find a way, keep smiling and keep being positive. And there's always a sunlight at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, make sure the test will be negative, but keep on being positive in attitude. That's
exactly.
The thing, huh?
Exactly.
But one of the things you said is about how political leaders, they need to correlate with one another, even at a time when you have geopolitics and also disagreements among countries, but still have to work on standards, work on a process, a procedure that everybody could make use of so that business could function. This is a crucial point.
It's so crucial. I mean, I'm so glad you give me the platform to say it. If you think about, when I was a kid, which is unfortunately a long, long time ago, we used to walk around with yellow WHO booklets, which showed that we had malaria jabs or tetanus or polio, etc. It was a worldwide standard. Yet in this day and age, we do not have a worldwide standard for dealing with COVID. And we need to think as a global community. You're right, there is geopolitics, there is differences, but we are an open global society and we need to have some common standards. And, being in the airline business, I've been to Europe, I've been to America, it's easier for me to go to America than it is to go to Singapore, which is half an hour away from me. So, and we're all kind of heavily vaccinated. So COVID is a great issue where the world should be working closer together. But there are, as you've said, hundreds of issues that are happening around the world that affects the common man because of geopolitics and less standards. And I hope APEC can kind of get its act together and help businesses and ultimately the common man.
I also hope that the political leaders attending the APEC meeting, whether online or offline, will be able to hear voices like yours so that they know how the businesses are functioning and how common men, quote unquote, as you said, are looking at their missions. Let me ask you also.
If you allow me,
go ahead,
one more
Tony.
thing. I think the other important thing in COVID is that we've got to balance economics and health. At the moment, health is running everything. And that's also a danger if we don't balance it with economics as well. So I hope governments will be more coordinated within themselves to balance saving lives, but also saving lives if the economy is too bad.
Some argue that at a time of pandemic, health also means business. health also means economy.
Correct. I mean, I think Asia Pacific is underestimating the mental health issues that are happening in our part of the world. We at AirAsia have been very proactive with my staff. Even before COVID, we talked about mental health, financial health, and physical health. But mental health is something Asia Pacific countries do not like to talk about. But it's a real problem, and COVID has made it worse. And so we have to also balance that with lockdowns and fears and all these things.
We talk about diversity, we talk about the corporate social responsibility, whether it's about gender or it's about environment, it's about other things. Many wonder whether businesses are just talking about it skin deep, or this will eventually come into their blood. This is very different, the two scenarios we're talking about. As a business leader, how do you see the trend at this point when we are juggling with so many different crises?
That's a fantastic question. In that, how do I answer this diplomatically? There is a lot of, without getting in trouble, there's a lot of things being done which are not sincere. I mean, if you really want to have diversity in the workplace, you don't need to be told. You just do it, right? It's a culture within AirAsia. We were the first airline to have female pilots. We have every color, every religion. We support, whatever sexual preference you are. We really believe in a meritocracy. We don't need to be told. We're not perfect, and we're always learning. So I do think there's a little bit of, overreaction and a lack of sincerity. But as I said, I'm hoping that these kind of things will change over a period of time and it becomes more natural. I like your description of skin deep. I'm not even sure it is at all deep. I think it's just on the skin. A lot of the time, people are just doing things because they feel that's the right thing to do. But hopefully over time, as we become more globalized, these kind of things become normal issues. But at AirAsia, we really believe in diversity. We really believe in 10,000 brains working for us as opposed to just 10, and have as flat structure as possible. And that's how we've grown from 2 planes to 250 planes, because we have an amazing culture in our company. We're not perfect, and we make mistakes, but we're transparent and honest enough to stick our hands up and say we could be better. But there is a lot of pressure on business leaders, at the moment to comply to so many different things. And little mistakes get blown out of proportion, and great leaders are lost through small little mistakes. I think the world is overreacting sometimes.
Since we're working on this keynote interview on the issue of sustainable business leader, I really wonder, precisely, would you share some of the key points with your counterparts from the Asia Pacific region?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all have to play a part in sustainability. I think climate gets a huge amount of attention, which we all play our part. I want to add just to say that sustainability, education of people in Asia Pacific would make a big difference. So companies can make a big difference by educating the public. And just my final thoughts is sustainability is not just about the climate. It's about sustainability of business, sustainability of environment on the ground, and sustainability of towns. But there's lots of issues, as the UN has put forward. So while climate is obviously a key one, there are many, many sustainable issues. And as I said on COVID, if governments don't get their act together, tourism is finished. Who's going to fly anywhere if you have to do 6 PCR tests? So there's a lot to discuss on sustainability apart from environment.
Tony Fernandez, entrepreneur and CEO of AirAsia Group. What a pleasure, sir. Tony, all the best.
Thank you very much.
Nā mihi kia kōrua. Thank you very much to Tony Fernandez and Tian Wei for a fascinating discussion. You have to say that Tony is not one to shy away from using direct language and telling us exactly what he thinks, which makes him a fascinating subject for a keynote interview in this 2021 APEC CEO Summit.
Tika, education a key part of his kōrero, which is educating not only his own staff in Air Asia or those who work under him or his counterparts, but the general public, him pushing that in terms of sustainability. It's not just on climate change, but they do have a duty, as do we all, to skill ourselves and to school ourselves up on what climate change means and what we as individuals are contributing in terms of carbon emissions and all that. So, yeah, and also to hear a bit about the aviation, the impact of COVID-19 on the aviation industry and whether or not there's a move towards electric aeroplanes and all that like. But good to hear from him directly that he doesn't expect that to happen within the next decade.
Yeah, I don't think Tony is expecting to see electric planes, certainly large-scale electric planes. You know, in the size jets that can carry a couple of hundred people within his time as CEO of Air Asia. But I thought it was interesting to hear Tony pass the term sustainability in even broader terms, because obviously when we talk about sustainability, usually we use it in an environmental context. But Tony talked about the importance, in his mind at least, and this might be a contentious perspective in some circles, that we need to think about sustainability in broader terms. So the sustainability of jobs, the sustainability of economies, as well as the sustainability of resources and of the planet. But obviously that is a tension that everyone within the airline industry needs to reckon with at the moment.
An important point that he also raised, which is, of course, balancing between all of it, not just one thing, not just climate change, not just sustainability, but, and I'm going to quote him on this, like you said, he's very direct, but, you know, balancing economics and health. And in his words, at the moment, health is running everything, and it's a danger from his standpoint if you don't balance it with the economics. And Asia Pacific, especially at this moment, you know, we're lagging behind. Not lagging, but there's a big uncertainty. There's a lot more uncertainty here.
Yeah, I'm sure there would be some people who heard those comments and said, well, actually, if you take a macro perspective on the economic response to COVID-19, those countries that have reacted to the pandemic with an aggressive health response have actually benefited from a stronger economic response as well, and that actually health and economics are directly linked. But that being said, I think it is an important tension, and it's an important area to continue having conversations about, because if we don't strike that balance appropriately, clearly we're all going to suffer. I think one point that everyone would agree with Tony is that it would be great to see more international cooperation, a more coherent and cohesive response when it comes to COVID-19. And when we go back to a state where we are travelling a little bit more than perhaps we are right now, not necessarily as we were before the pandemic, it would be great if we could get to a position where economies and governments work together, so we had international standards around vaccine passports and you know, freedom of movement. I think that's a really important point that many of us would agree with.
Absolutely, Jack. Tēnā koe. Right, taroa ke te iwi coming up shortly. We have an address from our next APEC economy leader.
The Māori economy already contributes about $18 billion a year to GDP, but we want that number to be much higher. These are complex and interlinked challenges, and it's on all of us to try and tackle them. At Westpac, we have work underway to address these issues.
What kind of happens, I think, you know, when we've brought these two cultures together, we've brought the skills that come from my Māori culture and the Māori side that has this innovation that goes back centuries, and combined it with the skills and knowledge of my Pākehā mates, you actually see the whole of the moon.
We're really proud to be a Māori business. I suppose what makes Silks unique is it's about making sure that people are at the centre of everything, because I think if you look after the well-being of the people, clients and staff, then it just allows the business to carry out what it usually does.
The Māori population is young and it's growing fast. Our rangatahi are our future. Providing them with the skills and support they need to thrive in the workforce is the first step to clearing those barriers that have traditionally held Māori back.
We are committed to helping break down these barriers. Whether it's enabling iwi with projects like Te Kaerearea, which supports mana motohaki, or it's unbundling our supply chain to create opportunities for Māori businesses and employment. And it's working with our government and corporate partners to ensure that the system changes to be more inclusive. Mahi kaha, mahi tahi, mo apopo. Let's work hard together for a better tomorrow.